So hopefully you've learned by now that classical conditioning, instrumental conditioning are working at levels that are not well controlled consciously. These are unconscious reactions to associations. This has a lot to do with things like fear and phobias, and also treatment for fear-related problems like phobias. So that's what we're going to talk about here. So there's lots of types of phobias. And maybe you can think of a phobia that you have. A phobia is kind of an irrational anxiety or fear or activation of the sympathetic nervous system that is in some way irrational. So there's lots of types of phobia. And in fact, this website has a list of all the kinds of phobias you can imagine. You can go to this list and look up alphabetically of something that you might show an irrational fear towards. And it gives it a name, right? Fear of wild animals, agoraphoobia. Go all the way down here. A popular fear, a fear of confined space, claustrophobia. Fear of clowns is coulrophobia. It's actually surprisingly common. How do you think a fear of clowns is created in terms of classical conditioning? Well, imagine a small child, 3 or 4 years old, and their parents decide for their birthday they're going to bring a clown. A stranger with extremely loud and obnoxious movements and makeup and popping balloons. That can be really terrifying, especially at that age, because children are neophobic, scared of new things. Well, now you've created an association. There's the clown, and you're feeling fear. Those two are in temporal contiguity. It doesn't take much, and you create those associations, right? I think right now I'm feeling a little of a politicophobia, fear of politicians, fear of mother-in-laws, fear of going to school, lots of fears. Some of the most common fears are fears like arachnophobia, fear of spiders, claustrophobia, fear of enclosed spaces, acrophobia, fear of heights. It's a funny Far Side cartoon. For the rest of life, the little reptile suffered from deep emotional scars. In other words, the little snake created a phobia. These are really important things evolutionarily. Animals have a tremendous ability to create associative fear. Why? Because it's all about survival. You might want to make an association that that bush over there has the kinds of berries you like to eat, or over there is some water, and those are really good for survival. But you better have a strong association to where a predator is or where something that's dangerous. These fears that we create are happening at an unconscious level, and we don't control them well. Primarily, these fears are associated in an area of the brain called the amygdala. And the frontal lobe can mediate what's happening at the amygdala, but the amygdala tends to win. Think about this. Somebody who's arachnophobic, they have a fear of spiders. Now, most spiders are very tiny, right? Little spider on the ground. And you think at a conscious level, using a declarative kind of understanding, that you are much bigger than that spider, and you could simply put your foot on the spider and the spider would die and you would win. But for some people who are really have a bad specific phobia of a specific thing like a spider, the fear can be overwhelming to the point where they can't move, or they might pass out, or it's really problematic. That doesn't make a lot of rational sense, but it's true. So specific phobias, they elicit withdrawal and avoidance. They're pretty common because they're pretty easy to make as children. Found in about 9 to 12% of the population. 9% over any given year, somebody says they have a phobia, 12% over the lifetime. Here's what's interesting. Some of these phobias you might think are a little funny, a little irrational. Oh, look at the person all scared of a little spider. But these are very serious anxiety disorders. So Phobias are within the class of anxiety. Anxiety has generalized anxiety disorder and PTSD and different types of phobias. And people with specific phobias are up to 60% more likely to attempt suicide. They can be really debilitating for some people. So the DSM can classify different types of phobias. So another type of phobia related is called social anxiety disorder, and this is a feeling of fear, irrational anxiety when you're in social groups or performance situations. This also leads to avoidance, and these are experiential. In other words, we don't really come to the world with these phobias. We have the ability to learn some phobias more easily than the others. We'll get to that, but we have to create these fears with experience. I remember when my child, who was very small at the time, happened many years ago, I hear a scream. I run into their bathroom, and there on the floor is a little green snake. And my son is on the other side. In other words, the snake is between me and my son, and he's looking up at me, and he's terrified. And all I could think of was, hey, this is the time we make phobias, right? He's ready to be scared of this. So I make a happy face and I grab the snake gently. I knew it was a little garden snake, wasn't going to hurt me. I go, look at this little creature. Isn't this a nice little creature? Let's take it outside and let it go. And you could see the relief, right? If I had a fear of snakes and I screamed and ran and fell over, that would have helped him create the phobias, because phobias are often created not only by a personal experience, but through observation. An observation of a significant other, a member of the family, or if you're an animal, member of the group, who shows fear to something else. So you can have that sort of association by modeling. Agoraphobia. Now, these are also really common. This is similar to these social phobias. This is an irrational anxiety about being in places from which escape might be difficult or embarrassing outside. We oftentimes think of agoraphobia as being fearful of outside the house. Agoraphobia and panic disorder, which is also a type of anxiety disorder, tend to go hand in hand. And a panic attack is a sudden onset of a fear response and feeling fear and emotions. This can be caused by a number of things. It can be caused by an event. It can be caused by a little bit too much CO2. There's certain types of herbs that can initiate a panic attack. But people are genetically more predisposed to creating this onset of fear response and the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. So imagine somebody with panic disorder. They're just outside walking around, and suddenly they have this overwhelming sense of terror and fear. Wherever they are, whatever they're seeing, those are stimuli that are in temporal contiguity with a feeling of fear. That's classical conditioning. How we understand fear and phobias, it's all Pavlovian. It's all classical conditioning, because it's taking place at a part of the brain we don't control, unconscious associations. And I'll tell you, it's a situation where your conscious brain cannot counteract easily these unconscious fears. I don't have a lot of fears. I like heights. I don't mind snakes. I don't mind crawly creatures. I don't show a lot of fears, but I have one single fear I always like to share with students, because there's always somebody out there that has my fear. I have a fear of the little packages that contain bakeable biscuits, the little round containers. Those things. That's my specific phobia. Why? How do you think I created this fear? When it's time to have these, and they're delicious, I have a difficult time opening them. I can do it. But my wife always makes fun of me because I hold it way away from my face and I open it really slowly and my eyes are squinting. I know as a rational person I could open this thing of biscuits right in front of my face and I would be safe as can be. But I can't do it. I can't do it. Why? Exactly right. When I was a kid, somebody gave me one of these and they said, "Hey, why don't you open these biscuits up?" And I'm like, "Yay, that sounds great." And I begin to peel them back, peel the paper back, and pop, it opens. Ah! Right? That was scary. I made that association not at a conscious level, but an unconscious level, that when I see those things, it's associated with this startled fear response. So John Watson was an early behaviorist, one of the first radical behaviorists. We've talked a little bit about him. He was the one who looked at how powerful the association of fear can be and how easily it's created using classical conditioning. So here's that famous study. So here's little baby Albert. Baby Albert's a very famous case study in psychology. And baby Albert was happy as can be, and they showed baby Albert a little white bunny. And baby Albert was like, "Hey, oh no!" Really loud noise was put on right behind little baby Albert, where he couldn't see it, but it startled and scared him. So, happy bunny, everything's good, loud noise, and little baby Albert put on a pink tank top and gotten terribly scared. What is he looking at when he was scared? He was looking at a little white bunny. And what John Watson found, other than the fact that he was capable of doing unethical research, you don't go around scaring babies, but he found that in the future, little baby Albert was very scared of white rabbits. But little baby Albert was also scared of a white fur coat. Why do you think that was? Generalization. We generalize phobias just like we generalize any type of classical conditioning. So in the future, just the white rabbit or anything white and furry made baby Albert scared and fearful, all because of that simple association. Now, a lot of therapies, there are things called behavioral focused therapies. There's cognitive behavioral therapy and there's behavioral therapy. And therapies to reduce these phobias or social anxieties, these type of phobias, they use principles of classical conditioning to reduce those fears. So if you can create fear using classical conditioning and phobias, you can create ways to reduce those fears. What do you think these type of treatments use? What Pavlovian simple methodology and principle? It's just extinction. They acquired the phobia because that thing was associated with fear or watching fear. So you have to present that stimuli without the fear production in a safe space, and we will see an extinction of the fear response. And this can be extremely helpful for people who have terrible fears. Some people have terrible fears of being in a car or flying or being outdoors. This is extremely disruptive to their life. And as a therapist, you will use what are known as exposure treatments. They're just another name for extinction. Subjects are exposed to the fear-initiating stimuli in a relaxed and safe environment. And there are several ways of doing this, and there are several treatments that use these methods. So one of the most common is known as systematic desensitization. Systematic. Here's what you do. You introduce the fear-producing stimuli, but more in a step-by-step fashion. And you counter-condition. You make those stimuli associated with good things, or you simply present them and you allow the fear to extinguish. There's also modeling, which is demonstrating appropriate responses to fear-producing stimuli. If you can learn the phobia through observation, observing somebody else be fearful, you can reduce some of those fearful responses by observing somebody who can hold a snake or a spider or something like that. There's another treatment that's not been around for a while, but it has really good efficacy. It really works well. This is known as eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR. You may have heard of it. This is a situation where people get into a rhythmic behavior in a therapist's office. Usually the eyes move back and forth. They watch something on a screen. And while they do that, they share or relive or rethink about traumatic events. And there's a lot of theories about why this works. It works really well for people with post-traumatic stress disorder, another anxiety disorder. Some people talk about the eye movement themselves and how it reprograms, and they get really detailed. Others look at this and just go, hey, it's just giving something for the brain to do while they're thinking about this trauma. While they're re-experiencing the fear and anxiety, let the brain work on something else, and that in a way reduces the fear response while they're thinking about the traumatic event. There's also flooding. This works extremely well to reduce phobias. It works really well. It's just really harsh because instead of systematically presenting stimuli, you make them deal with the full stimuli a lot and let the fear response extinguish. Let's look at two of these in a little bit more detail. The two most kind of common, systematic desensitization and flooding. Let's take a look at those. So let's say somebody has a terrible fear of spiders. Now, this might not be a problem if they live maybe in a city and they don't be around spiders, but sometimes they have such a fear of spiders that generalizes to anywhere they've ever seen a spider, which generalizes to anywhere outside. They don't want to go outside. Again, just like every single disorder, phobias are on a spectrum. For some people, it's just, I don't like spiders and I get uncomfortable about them. I know this spider's harmless, but I don't want anything to do with them and I get a little icky. To other people who are debilitated by their phobia. So here's what you might do. You might take somebody, bring them into the office. Let's say you're a therapist. And sometimes people are hooked up to a physiology machine. Let's look at your heart rate. Let's monitor your skin response, but not necessary. And you simply say, I want you to breathe. I want you to relax. And I want you just for a moment to think of a spider. And they get all anxious and scared. Okay, breathe. And you're in a safe place and relax. And I want you to, this might take several sessions to get to a person so where they can think about a spider without overdoing the emotional response. In other words, they're thinking about the stimuli, but they're not producing and feeling the overwhelming fear. So the fear extinguishes. Then you might show them a picture. Again, this might take many sessions. They simply look at a cartoon version of a spider, something not very realistic, and you allow them to show a slight fear response, and the fear response then, while looking at the picture, extinguishes. The CS, the spider, is presented without the US, the overwhelming fear. Again, this might take a long time. People often use breathing exercises, meditative exercises, mindfulness meditation. Then you get to a point where you systematically get more and more detail. Now you bring in a cage with a spider in it. I've known therapists who specialize in dealing with anxiety and phobia. They have a pet spider. Why do they have a pet spider? Because arachnophobia is so common. And they got to bring that spider in a little cage now, well into the therapy. The person is seeing the spider. It's live. It's there. They're feeling a little bit of fear, and they allow that to reduce. They extinguish that. You extinguish one stage before moving to another. And if this is done right, the person can have a spider walking on their hand. Might take several weeks. Might take several sessions. Who knows? Now, I want you to think about what you understand about classical conditioning, because we have a problem with this. The person has this therapy and it works really well, and they have a spider crawling on their hand and they say, thanks, doc, you cured me, I'm fine. And the doctor says, you need to come back for checkups and you need to go through this again. Because what will likely happen is in 2 weeks, you'll be walking around, you'll see a spider on the ground, and you'll have that fear response come back. What is that called in our understanding of extinction? That's called spontaneous recovery. It works in phobias like it works with anything else. After some period of time, the conditioned response, the excitatory associations come back. So they need to go through extinction again. We also see rapid reacquisition. If they see a spider and they're showing this tremendous fear response, that association is going to come back quickly. This is a good way, a good therapy, but it takes time and it takes retreatment. The other one is flooding. And what I know about flooding is it tends to work really well. This is where you immerse the person in a full-scale exposure to the fear-producing stimuli. And the fear response is intense. So let's take, for example, somebody who has a terrible fear of germs and they can't go into public bathrooms. You might take them to a public bathroom and lock them inside. Now, of course, that sounds cruel, but sometimes a person, if they know what they're getting into and you tell them it really works and they need this in their life, they can be willing to do it. They need to be monitored, safety protocols, but this works faster and actually sometimes better than systematic desensitization because of what's known as the general adaptation syndrome. So imagine somebody who's feared of spiders and they're put into a place where there's just spiders everywhere. They go through 3 phases. So Hans Selye was one of the most famous researchers of anxiety. And there's great stories about his research. I really like reading them. And he really understands the stress response, the fight or flight response. Here's what happens. So this is the stress, how they are resistant to stress. But the first phase is known as the alarm phase. So here's the person, and they're surrounded by spiders, and they're terribly arachnophobic. The fear response is overwhelming. The sympathetic nervous system goes through the roof. Cortisol is released and adrenaline is released from the adrenal gland. All the stress responses, the sympathetic nervous system is overwhelmed. And it is just, the body is physiologically producing all these stress reactions. Then there is a resistance phase. The body resists the stress, can only last so long. In other words, you can't keep producing adrenaline. You don't have an unlimited supply. You can't keep producing cortisol, which is a hormone response to stress. You can't do this forever. And you will begin to show what's called exhaustion. What does that mean? After a little while of being in that horribly disgusting public bathroom, if you're fear of germs, or sitting in a room with spiders walking around the ceiling, there's a point after several minutes where you're not producing a fear response. Your body's not producing it. You're not producing adrenaline. You're not producing cortisol. Those systems are fatigued. And here you are, your body is surrounded by the CS, the stimuli that produces the fear, but your body is not producing the fear response. Why? It can't anymore. It's run out. Well, that's extinction. The spiders are there, but the fear response isn't because it's exhausted. And again, you can see the controversy of this, but no one can deny the efficacy. Tends to work, tends to reduce fear responses. You're still going to get spontaneous recovery and those other problems, but as a treatment, if the people are willing to do it, it works pretty well. As a therapist, I would have a really hard time doing it. Professor Gallagher and his controversial technique of simultaneously confronting the fear of height, snakes, and the dark. Gary Larson's hilarious, but that right there is flooding. Okay, let's understand fear a little bit more. We have what's called reactivity. These are specific responses to fear situations. And these are innate, and it can be changed. It can be modified through selective breeding. This is innate fear responses. This isn't learned. And a lot of animals show this, but there's been a lot of cases of selectively breeding wild animals to the point where they're not showing that reactivity, such as foxes. So foxes have been bred. They were used for fur. And the people who were raising them for fur, this happens in Russia, they had to work with these extremely dangerous wild animals. So these people had these ideas of, let's just have a bunch of fox pups, and whichever ones aren't showing reactivity to us, aren't showing the least amount of fear response to humans, we will breed those, and we're gonna go ahead and kill and use the fur of the other ones. Generation after generation after generation, they produced foxes that were more and more tractable. That's the word it's often used, meaning handleable or not as responsive. What's interesting is in the selective breeding process, you also what also happened with the reduction of these reactivity of fear, this innate response to humans, is you tended to produce a fox that looked a little different. They tended to have more of a curly tail and different ears, and some people think that it selectively bred them to remain as sort of young pups. And that was some of the idea of what dogs are today, selectively bred over thousands of years from wild dogs or coyotes and wolves to be sort of adult pups and bred to not show the reactivity to humans. Now, there's also what's known as preparedness. This is different from reactivity. Preparedness is not an innate fear response, an automatic reflexive fear response without learning. Preparedness is the idea that some stimuli, because of genetics, are more easily associated with fear than others. So let's say somebody is raised in a house, and in this house, the family owns a pet store. And there are snakes and lizards and big tarantulas. Then they see them all day long. They're not going to show this phobic fear. But they would have an easier time learning to fear some things than others. They're not fearful automatically of snakes and spiders. But snakes and spiders and bees and some other things, we have an easier time to create that association than we would other things. So we have innate reactivity fear. Most humans, when they're tiny little babies, they go through a phase of what's known as neophobia, right? This happens later in the first year. And you see this all the time. A little baby, when the baby is 2 months old, they pass that baby around to all the relatives, and the baby's like, yay! And the baby's no fear at all. And then, as they get a little older, 9 to 12 months, you go up, a stranger's there, and they hide behind mom and dad's pant leg. And they're just like, who are you? A little scared of new things. Now we have learned fear, which is phobias and associations, and we have to have those experiences. And so reactivity is more of the innateness of fear. Preparedness is an ease at which fear can be learned. And then the learned fear is because of classical conditioning, creating these phobias. We also have, especially in groups that live together, animals that live in groups, we have observationally conditioned fear. I mentioned this earlier. We don't have to have this horrible experience of being bit by a dog to have a fear of dogs. We can see a family member get bit and scared to death by a dog, and we can learn that. So let's talk about an interesting study done by Martin Seligman. Martin Seligman is a very famous psychologist. He was the founder of positive psychology. He's done a lot of work on learned helplessness and fear. He was the president of the APA, American Psychological Association, for a number of years. In the early 1970s, he did this really interesting study. And it was about modeling fear in monkeys. So we have models And we had observers observing the models. We'll get to that in a second. And the measurement was the willingness to reach for food, a food treat, over a box containing either a snake or a flower. This is getting into that idea of preparedness. So one observer monkey saw another monkey on a video showing fear response. It wasn't a monkey right there. It wasn't showing fear of a flower. It was simply showing fear. Monkey saw this monkey showing fear, and what was next to it was a flower. So now we have classical conditioning. Observation fear, which is an unconditioned stimulus because it produces fear in a monkey. You see another monkey scared to death, you're going to get scared naturally. And a conditioned stimulus, just a flower. Okay? That's one group. The other group of animals, group 2, again, the monkey saw one monkey showing tremendous fear. On a video, fear, terrible fear. And what was next to him was a snake. So the snake is the CS, the US is the fear that this monkey is showing, which produces natural fear response in this monkey. Over here on the right, the unconditioned response is a fear response brought about by an unconditioned stimulus, which is seeing a fellow monkey being scared. And these two are in temporal contiguity. And then it was simply your willingness to reach over a box with either a flower or a snake. And what they found was that this group that saw an animal, a fellow monkey, being scared of a snake, being scared while there's a snake there, that monkey would not reach over. That he produced a fear of this little rubber snake. I think they used rubber snakes, right? And the monkeys weren't showing a natural innate fear to it, but it learned it wouldn't do it. But it was a flower. It was like, yeah, sure, fine, I'll reach over that. Even though it had the same experience way back here. In other words, it was very difficult to associate a flower with a fear response, but they had no problem making an association between a rubber snake and a fear response. They were prepared to learn to fear the snake, and they were not innately prepared to learn to fear a flower. Okay? No way on the snake, happy to reach over the flower. A similar study was done with humans, and it was about preparedness. And so in 2001, it was done by Oman. Human participants were asked to find snakes or spiders in a background of flowers and mushrooms. They were asked to find snakes and spiders. Or another group was asked to find flowers hidden in patterns, flowers and mushrooms in a background of snakes. Now, if there's preparedness to learn to fear snakes over learning to fear flowers, then one would expect greater attention to finding those snakes. Participants identified the snakes and spiders more easily than the group that looked for flowers hidden in a group of snakes. It indicated an innate genetic predisposition to see the snakes and to learn about the snakes and spiders than the flowers. Being fearful of things that are like flowers, it's difficult to create those fearful associations. I'm not saying we can't do it. That's not easy. We are prepared. We're not coming to the world terrified of spiders, terrified of snakes, phobic of those. But it doesn't take much for us to learn to fear those things. We don't come to the world fearful of flowers, but it's really hard to make that association. To be phobic of flowers is really uncommon. It would take a tremendously traumatic thing. It's easy to be scared of snakes and spiders. And we can see the evolutionary stability of this type of preparedness. Because you're not going to be dying by a nice iris here. You could die from a snake bite or a spider bite or something like that. That could be dangerous. Okay? What do you fear? And how did you create that fear?